Hey Techno Studs! Another way a threat agent is going to get into our networks, into our data, into the areas we don't want them to get into is by credentials, by hacking our credentials, by hacking our passwords. So let's talk about how passwords are hacked. When it comes to passwords being hacked, there's really just two categories. Number one, either the hacker knows the password or they've guessed at the password. If they know the password, then either that password's been told to them or they've stolen it somehow. So that's the know the password, and then there's the guess the password, and there's a few ways that they can actually guess passwords. So in this video, we're gonna talk about how they would know or guess at the password. There's a lot of different methods in which a password could be stolen. For instance, social engineering is an example. Whether it's some sort of phishing campaign that's happened or some sort of shoulder surfing, they could steal it from the actual user themselves. Another thing that can happen is eavesdropping. Now, there are times that we type passwords into our machines or the password is being sent across the network. And if that gets intercepted and listened to, and maybe it's a keylogger, as we're typing it into the keyboard, as it's sending it across, perhaps there's a man in the middle where they can take a look at the packets that are being sent across and see what your password is. There's also data breaches. Maybe there's some sort of malware or the network was hacked where they got a database of information of a bunch of passwords and usernames of the company. Just a brief insight into this man in the middle or on path. Man in the middle or on path could be a form of eavesdropping, although there's other purposes for having a man in the middle attack as well. Man in the middle of attack is if you have a machine that wants to talk to a server over here, but somehow the information is actually going through some other device that it was not intended. Well, now this is a man in the middle or a device in the middle, or like I say, an on path attack. And so this is one of the attacks that can happen for eavesdropping. A hacker could get a hold of your password in one of a couple different ways. Number one is that password could be just plain text, which means they see what your password is. For instance, let's say they used a keylogger and got your password, and that keylogger just records the keystrokes that you have and sends it to them. And so they would be able to see exactly what your password is in plain text. But it also could come to them encrypted. And an example like this is, let's say they go and get a password database that they've downloaded, that they hacked into somebody's site, and they got a hold of the people's usernames and passwords. If it's encrypted correctly, then they have an encrypted form of your password. And that can be difficult for them to actually figure out what your actual password is. Because a good encryption, it's going to be almost impossible. A good encryption, they're not going to be able to reverse engineer that and figure out what your actual password is. But there's something, this thing called a rainbow table that can actually help them out. And what that means, a rainbow table is a reference table. And once again, it's hard to reverse engineer from a good encrypted password to figure out what the plain text is. But they do know what the algorithms are to go the other way, to take your password and encrypt it. They do know how that part operates, how that part works. And so what they do is they take a bunch of different passwords or maybe some sort of sequences and they plug it into their algorithm, and then they figure out what the encrypted version of that looks like, and they put it into a table. And that's called a rainbow table. The rainbow table is going to record plain text passwords and then the encrypted passwords. And so where this comes into play is now if they have your encrypted password, they're going to look up on this table to try to find what your plain text password is. And the best way to be able to combat this is to have good passwords, long passwords that are well constructed, and then it's going to make it almost impossible for them to use rainbow tables, because rainbow tables definitely have their limits. Then you have the brute force attack. Brute force attack is just when they're guessing. They're just going to guess a lot of credential combinations to try to gain access to a system. So they're looking at, maybe it's a username, and a password to get into the system. Now, one thing that's common with a brute force attack is that the username would be given. They would have some sort of given username that they have, and then they're trying a bunch of different passwords that they don't know to see if they can gain access to it. But spraying kind of works in the opposite. Spraying is actually a type of brute force attack, but spraying is that they have a single password that they're trying on a lot of different usernames or a lot of different accounts. And so a good example of this might be is that there's some sort of company that has a default password to get into a certain system. And the hacker knows this. So they use this default password, but then they try a lot of different accounts to try to gain access into that system. And if your company uses those default passwords, it makes you susceptible to this type of an attack. But a hacker has ways to be able to shortcut to find out what your password is going to be. They essentially take an educated guess. Let's talk about some guessing methods that they have. It could be that they're just trying everything. They start out with, let's say it's a system that has a 3-character password is the minimum. Well, then they could guess 000, 001, 002, 003, and so on and so forth, and just guess every single character all the way up to the NZZZ, and then they start out with 4 characters and try 4 characters and then 5 characters and just keep guessing from that perspective to break into that system. Or perhaps they're trying a bunch of common passwords. That's amazing how there's the same passwords are used over and over and over again out there, and it's kind of insane actually. So don't use your default passwords. Make sure you change those passwords. Make sure it's not one of those common passwords that are out there. There is also the dictionary passwords where they'll just try a single dictionary word or multiple dictionary words. So don't use a single or double dictionary word. Make sure that if you're using dictionary words, you're using many of them. So that's going to be a key with that. They'll also take a look at information they know. Maybe they know your date of birth. Maybe they know your kid's date of birth. Maybe they know, the address that you live at. They'll use all of those numbers and sequences, and they'll use that information to try to break into your accounts. Then there's something called credential stuffing. Credential stuffing just means that let's say there's a company XYZ, and you have created sometime in the past, you have created an account for XYZ. And that company got compromised and all their passwords were hacked and stolen. And so now those get uploaded into this database for all cyber criminals to be able to have access to. And you could actually go out there and download this database of all this past hacked passwords. And then what they do is they find out, well, you have this password at this one site that you got onto, this XYZ site. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start trying out that same username and password combination for all of these other sites to see if I can break into things like your social media. So that's credential stuffing, is using this database that's accessible to anyone out there and taking the compromised passwords that already exist out there on your account, and then trying those on your other accounts that you have. And then we have the mask attack. A lot of times people will use some sort of pattern that they'll have to be able to access different sites. And so a great example of this is when you require your users to change passwords, they just increment the numbers up. So whatever their password is with a 1 at the end, and their password with a 2 at the end, their password with 3 at the end. Well, it's pretty easily guessable what the sequence is going to be. And same thing if you have multiple companies that got their sites compromised, somebody can take a look at what your passwords are and reverse engineer that to figure out what your next password is going to be for any particular site. So if you use some sort of patterns to be able to remember your different passwords to different sites, that could be problematic. And just as an example, I've gone to this Have I Been Pwned site right here, which I've utilized quite a bit. I typed in one of my past emails that I had at a company that I worked for to see what other companies I had registered for, and it got hacked. So as you can see here, these are all of the companies in the databases that got hacked that had information that was compromised. For instance, this one, I had an email address, an employer, geographical location, job titles, names, phone numbers, and social media profiles hacked. So here's a LinkedIn one, and as part of it, all sorts of information along that. So as you can see here, this is just one of my many emails that I have that has a ton of information that's been hacked out there. So this is a good site to go to and just check out to see if you have had an issue in the past where your username and password has been hacked out there. As you can see, threat agents have a few different ways they can approach into getting people's usernames and passwords. And it can be quite devastating to those people and the networks that they're on. And so we're really going to want to safeguard against that. In future modules, we'll talk about how to safeguard and practice good password management, but we're also going to take it from a perspective that we're going to be managing users and creating policies for users. And what is the best way to be able to set those policies and ways that our users are going to manage their own passwords to make sure that they're secure.